The result of all counsel may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estate within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
You may be seated. This Honourable House now resumes its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Lloyd Smith, Mr. Paulwell, Mrs. Simpson Miller, Dr. Phillips, Dr. Davies. Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Bunting, Mr. Kellier, Mr. George Hilton, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. R. Scott, Reverend Thwaites, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Daly, Dr. Guy, Mrs. Nita Headley, Mr. Atkinson, Mr. Luther Buchanan, Mr. Luther Buchanan, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Azan, Mr. Hales, Mr. Fagan, Mrs. Fawkes Abrahams, Mr. Crawford, Mr. Brown, Mr. Bartlett, Dr. Baugh, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Hugh Buchanan, Mr. Paul Buchanan, Dr. Campbell, Dr. Chan, Mr. Charles, Mr. Chuck, Miss Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Duncan, Miss Grange, Dr. Green, Mr. Henry, Mr. Holness, Mr. Hutchinson, Mr. Andre Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Mayer, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Parchment, Mr. Michael Phillips, Mr. Price, Mr. Robertson, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Shaw, Mr. Silvera, Mr. Derek Smith, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Darrell Vaz, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Walford, Mr. Warmington, Dr. Wheatley.
Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Ministry Paper number 29 entitled Statistical Institute of Jamaica Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the year ended March 31, 2014. Ministry Papers 30 and 31, Sugar Industry Authority Annual Reports and Audited Financial Statements for financial years 2010-11 and 2011-12. Ministry Papers numbers 32 and 33 entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues dated February 9 and 16, 2015. Green Paper number 2, Forest Policy for Jamaica, and this supersedes the document tabled in the House on February 24, 2015. Airports Authority of Jamaica Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial years 2011-12, 2012-13 and 2013-14. Nutrition Products Limited Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial year 2013-2014. The Jamaica Tourist Board Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial year 2013-2014. Jamaica Vacations Limited, JAMVAC, Annual Reports and Audited Financial Statements for the financial years 2010-11, 2011-12, and 2012-13. Bank of Jamaica Annual Report and Statements of Accounts for the year ended December 2014. Bauxite and Alumina Trading Company of Jamaica Limited Annual Reports and Audited Financial Statement for the financial years 2011-12 and 2012-13. Jamaica Bauxite Institute Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial year 2010-11. E-Learning Jamaica Company Limited Annual Reports for the financial years 2010-11, 2011-12, and 2012-13. Scientific Research Council Annual Reports and Audited Financial Statements for the financial years 2010-11 and 2011-12. Kingston and Montego Bay Free Zones Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial years 2010-11 to 2012-13. Devon House Development Company Limited Annual Report and Audited Financial Statement for the financial year 2011-12. Government of Jamaica Growth Agenda Policy Paper for the financial year 2015-16. National Library of Jamaica Annual Report and Audited Financial Statements for the financial year 2010-2011. Statistical Institute of Jamaica Publications on the External Trade Bulletin January to November 2014 Preliminary Data. Producer Price Index Annual Report 2014. Social Statistics 2014. Quarterly Gross Domestic Product Special Report January to September 2014. Consumer Price Index Annual Report 2014, the Labor Force Survey Report 2014, Jamaica Environment in Your Pocket 2015. The Anti-Doping in Sport Amendment of 4th Schedule Order 2015 under the Anti-Doping in Sport Act 2014.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions, papers, reports from committees. Minister Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on the Jamaica Estimates of Expenditure 2015-16 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2016, the Jamaica Public Bodies Estimates of Revenue and Expenditure for the year ending March 2016, the Jamaica 2015-2016 Public Sector Consolidated Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2016, the Government of Jamaica Fiscal Policy Paper for the financial year 2015-2016, the Medium-Term Debt Management Strategy for the financial years 2015-16 to 2017-18, the Tax Expenditure Estimates 2011 to 2013, the Jamaica Revenue Estimates 2015-2016 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2016, and the Auditor General's Department examination of the components of the fiscal policy paper, which was laid before the House of Representatives on February 19, 2015.
Notices of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move, be it resolved that the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on the Jamaica Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2016, and all the other reports mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, be approved, that were laid on the table of the House on the 12th day of March 2015, be approved. I further beg to give notice, Mr. Speaker, that at a later stage today, I will move that the standing orders be suspended to enable me to take this motion. I also beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum Out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2016 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament. I also beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take first reading of the bill and to commence debate on the second reading.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House. First obtained. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion regarding the report of the Standing Finance Committee, notice of which I gave earlier.
The question is for the suspension of the standing orders to allow for the Minister to take. The report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House.
Yes.
Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the debate is on the appropriation bill, but we must first move for the report of the Standing Finance Committee, the reports of the Standing Finance Committee to be approved. I so move that the report of the Standing Finance Committee on the estimates of expenditure and all the other reports which were mentioned, Mr. Speaker, be approved.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to introduce and have a read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2015 and also for me to commence debate on the second reading of the bill.
Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, before we proceed, may I move for the recommittal of item presentation of bills?
Question is for the recommittal of item presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time the following bill shortly entitled the Property Tax Amendment Act 2015, the Land Valuation Amendment Act 2015, the Tax Collection Amendment Act 2015, and the Income Tax Amendment Act 2015.
Bill shortly entitled Property Tax Amendment Act 2015 read a first time. Bill shortly entitled the Land Valuation Amendment Act 2015 read a first time. Bill shortly entitled the Tax Collection Amendment Act 2015 read a first time. Bill shortly entitled Income Tax Amendment Act 2015 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of these bills. Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time the bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2015.
A bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2015 read a first time.
Yes, I will describe this. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill. Take this one. Mr. Speaker, at the outset of this budget debate, I wish to acknowledge the support and guidance of all those who have made it possible for me to continue in the discharge of my responsibilities in the Ministry of Finance and Planning. This list includes the constituents of East Central St. Andrew, led by the councillors and the constituency executive, and the members of the various communities who have elected me to this Parliament and who continue to offer invaluable support and assistance no matter how difficult the challenges we face. I would also like to place on record my appreciation to the Most Honourable Prime Minister for her continued confidence and support, and to the other members of the Cabinet who have all accepted the need for the economic reform program and who have also provided valuable advice and support along the way. Mr. Speaker, my parliamentary colleagues, special appreciation and commendation goes to my colleague and friend, the Honourable Horace Daly, who shares the responsibilities in this challenging ministry and who has guided its public sector components with tremendous insight, dexterity, and skill. I am confident that I express the sentiments of the Honourable House as I pay tribute to you, Mr. Speaker, for your stern guidance of the affairs of the House and for helping to steer the ambitious legislative agenda attached to the economic reform program through this Honourable House. Our achievements to date would not have been possible without the support of the staff of the Ministry of Finance and Planning and its affiliated agencies. I would like to pay particular tribute to the Financial Secretary and the other members of the team at the Ministry of Finance and Planning, the Governor and staff of the Bank of Jamaica, the Director General and staff of the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Financial Services Commission, the Export-Import Bank, the Development Bank of Jamaica, and Statin. This list is by no means complete, and I therefore also want to include all the other agencies in this tribute. Let me also acknowledge the selfless service of chairmen and members of the various boards. Too often we fail to recognize that government would not be able to function if not for the selfless commitment of the many Jamaicans from all walks of life who serve on various boards as a civic duty and who, for the most part, operate without any consideration of remuneration. I now turn to the members of my advisory group, led by the Honourable Shirley Tyndall and Mr. Dennis Morrison, who answer every call and place their experience and capabilities at the service of the country. I include, Mr. Speaker, my own personal staff for their commitment and their loyalty, which they demonstrate in the long hours of overtime that remain unpaid, and for their patience in coping with my own temperament. Most of all, extremely. Most of all, let me acknowledge that without the love and support of my family, especially my wife Sandra, and children, it would have been nigh impossible to survive the rigors of public life. These acknowledgements, however, would not be complete without a special thanks to the thousands of Jamaicans for their love and support. Some write letters, others use their private mobile phones, and there are those who walk up to me in the streets or ask for one away at a private function or at a church to express their thanks and appreciation for the effort we all make. Very often their reassurances, advice, and words of encouragement come at a particularly difficult time, and most will never know how deeply I'm touched by their considerations or the extent to which they motivate me to make even greater effort. I'm always conscious, Mr. Speaker, of the guidance of the Almighty as the foundation on which I try to build a life of service. This year, the budget debate discussions can be safely described as groundbreaking. For the first time, we have carried out the functions within the context of the recently updated Fiscal Governance Framework. The enhanced framework established amendments to the Fiscal Administration and Audit Act and the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act and regulations tabled in March 2014 and January 2015 has created a new budget cycle which strengthens the rules governing preparation and approval. Under the enhanced Fiscal Governance Framework, the annual estimates of revenue and expenditure must be tabled at the same time and in time for their approval by both houses of Parliament no later than March 31st of the year preceding that to which the estimates relate. Indeed, this is the earliest in my memory, and I believe in the memory of all of us here that we have conducting and concluding this budget debate. All the supporting documents are to be tabled with the estimates of revenue and expenditure. These include the fiscal policy paper, the public bodies report, the debt management strategy, and the tax expenditure report. It includes also the Auditor General's review of the fiscal policy paper, which must be completed within 2 weeks and submitted to the Speaker of the House for the meeting of the Standing Finance Committee. It includes also the tabling of the appropriations bill, which must take place no later than 1 week after the Standing Finance Committee has completed its examination of the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, I am particularly pleased that this new process has been successfully implemented despite a few challenges. I also wish to thank the many persons, including those from within this House on both sides, who have offered suggestions, and to advise them that discussions have already begun with a view to further strengthening the process. An important point that I must emphasize is that the enhanced fiscal rules are expected to outlast this and succeeding administrations. Strengthening the fiscal rules by providing greater transparency and accountability in fiscal governance through the enhancement of the roles of the Auditor General and the Parliament can only serve to improve and strengthen our democracy and strengthen the foundations of our economy. These new procedures deserve the support of all Jamaicans, regardless of political, social, or economic differences. On both sides of the House, we have the collective responsibility to ensure that the benefits that have been achieved as a result of the sacrifices being made by all Jamaicans are safeguarded. We must consolidate these gains by constructive debate and informed dialogue so that we never return to the privations that we now seek to cure. Mr. Speaker, so far, so good. However, even as the foundations on which we build are being strengthened, we must seize the time to expand opportunities for all our people. 3 years ago, this administration launched Jamaica's economic reform program. It was appropriately captioned a new and binding covenant for stability, equitable growth, and prosperity. Needless to say, the covenant was between the administration and the people of Jamaica, since only such a partnership could achieve those objectives. While I've been making regular progress reports, I want to use this presentation, which opens the 2015-16 budget debate, to provide a comprehensive assessment of our performance over the last 3 years of the program. In the process, I want to address some of the questions that are uppermost in the minds of Jamaicans. Are we on track? Where have we reached? What are the challenges we presently face? And finally, what are our prospects as we mobilize the entire country to achieve the equitable growth that will form the basis of our prosperity in the years to come? Let me begin, Mr. Speaker, by taking time to emphasize a fact which often gets blurred in the public debate. The economic reform program which is underway is Jamaica's program, a program which we would have had to undertake with or without the IMF support. Mr. Speaker, we welcome the support of the IMF through the extended fund facility and the technical assistance that has been provided. This support was critical to our success in restoring Jamaica's trustworthiness in the international community. Let me remind my colleagues that the IMF support is a seal of approval of the policies being undertaken, which allows us to unlock other international resources, both from governmental sources, multilateral sources, and private international financial institutions. In short, the support of the IMF, together with the assistance of other developmental institutions, has made the critical difference to the successful implementation of our capacity building programs for fiscal, administration, and other financial sector reforms. Question may be asked, why was the program necessary? This question can be answered in one word: debt. Jamaica, over the years, has built up an unsustainable stock of public debt, which for the past 40 years has acted as a millstone around the neck of every Jamaican. I should remind you that at the start of the program, public debt as defined under the extended fund facility was approximately 145% of GDP. In the context of the rupture in the relationship between Jamaica and the IMF and our other development partners in 2011, following the then administration's abandonment of the standby agreement, our debt was patently unsustainable. We were closed off from capital markets. No one would lend us money at affordable rates. Our reserves were dwindling. Investor confidence was diminished, and debt repayment was eating up the bulk of our revenues and of our budget. Let me be clear and let me be fair. The buildup of debt did not happen overnight. It didn't happen in the 4 years of the previous administration. Neither was it borrowed from the International Monetary Fund. It was successive Jamaican governments that borrowed and spent on loans which created this debt. We must acknowledge as a country that we failed over the past 4 decades to sustain economic growth. Average purchasing power of income per person in 2012 was the same as it was 40 years ago. Since the start of the extended fund facility in May 2013, we have been honoring all our commitments to the stakeholders. We have honored the commitments to the workers, who by their wage restraint agreements contributed to meeting the prior conditions stipulated under the program. And we have honored all our commitments to other stakeholders, including our creditors and including our partners in the international community. I should remind this House, however, that even though there were wage restraint agreements with the workers, this administration continued to meet obligations to the workers which had been entered into by previous administrations, including payments under the health sector reclassification agreement, 7% back pay to public sector workers, which was awarded by the courts after a dispute during the previous administration. We honored back pay to teachers and outstanding wage payments in relation to salary realignment for correctional officers and firemen. In addition, Mr. Speaker, we have met our obligations to pensioners, financial institutions, and others. This administration takes special pride in meeting our obligations to those Jamaicans whose critical support for the program has put us on a path to debt sustainability. To meet our commitments to full transparency, we established the Economic Program Oversight Committee, and their regular reports have kept Jamaicans abreast as to our progress, and I dare say, Mr. Speaker, helped to build public confidence in the transparency and the commitment to transparency of the administration. The fiscal discipline that we have imposed on ourselves will enable us to make the first major repayment of $62 billion of maturing bonds issued under the National Debt Exchange, which comes due in February 2016. And I think I should serve notice to the banks, financial institutions, and pensioners. We don't intend to re-borrow these amounts, Mr. Speaker. I'd best advise them to find viable investment schemes to put that money to work, augmenting growth in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, this is a matter of some pride for us, as is the case with the IMF quarterly reviews. The record shows that we do not take our commitments lightly when we enter into agreements. We meet our obligations. We have successfully completed 6 consecutive quarterly tests under the Extended Fund Facility Program, and based on the positive mission report from the fund team that was here, I have every expectation that by the end of this month, the board of the International Monetary Fund will have approved the 7th quarterly review. Mr. Speaker, let me emphasize that the passing of these IMF tests has been the critical factor in restoring Jamaica's trustworthiness in the international community. It is the passing of the IMF test that enabled Jamaica to re-enter the global capital markets and secure the interest rate that was the lowest ever secured by Jamaica in its history. It is the passing of the IMF test that has made Jamaica more and more attractive to investors, both local and foreign. And these investments provide more jobs for ordinary Jamaicans because we pass the IMF test. It is the passing of the IMF test which has helped create the present favorable economic environment in which business confidence is at one of its highest levels since they have been conducting the business surveys. It is the passing of these IMF tests why consumer confidence is growing in Jamaica. Of particular note in the last business survey is the observation, and I quote, that an all-time record number of firms voiced their intention to increase their investments in their own businesses during the year ahead, end quote. All of these things translate ultimately. No, it was in the, you didn't read. I know you didn't read it. I know you didn't read it. All of these things translate ultimately into better opportunities for our people, better prospects for employment and earnings, and investments in our educational system, our health sector, and other social protection measures. Mr. Speaker, we can ask the question, what other positive outcomes have been achieved, and what improvements have taken place in the macroeconomic environment? You will recall that the major underpinning for the economic reform program was the stranglehold of debt. It must therefore be a source of relief for every Jamaican that our debt is on a downward trajectory. The most reliable measurement of the stock of debt in any country is the debt to GDP ratio, because it gives an indication of the capacity of the country to repay its debts. In dollar terms, the debt to GDP ratio, which stood at 145.7% at the end of 13-14, is projected to reduce to 139.7% of GDP at the end of 2014-15, and is scheduled to be 130.7% of GDP at the end of fiscal year 2015-16, moving to below 100% of GDP by 2020. I need to point out to this Honourable House that the debt to GDP ratio would have been even further reduced at this point, but for the fact that we took a deliberate decision last year to borrow more than had been programmed in order to make certain that we would be able to honor our commitments to bondholders that are due to be repaid this year. We were able to borrow $800 million at the lowest rates ever obtained by Jamaica in the private capital markets, instead of the $500 million that had been originally sought. At the time the decision was taken, the expectation was that the uncertainties in global capital markets and the possibility of rising interest rates in the United States clouded the prospect of Jamaica raising equivalent funds later on in the year at the same rates. As a consequence of this decision, we have been able to guarantee our debt repayment for more than a year and to engage in more ambitious debt buyback arrangements than had been previously anticipated. It was a sound economic decision, confirmed not least by the improvements in the outlook on Jamaica by the credit rating agencies. Another area in which we assess our progress is the state of our net international reserves, which at the end of February stood at $1.9 billion, with gross reserves covering approximately 17.1 weeks of imports of goods and services, comfortably above the international benchmark of 12 weeks of imports of goods and services. The country's balance of payments deficit on the current account continues to decline. The forecasted outturn on the current account deficit for this fiscal year, 2014-15, is 5.3% of GDP, influenced both by a containment of domestic demand and by the demand in related imports, including oil, and the improvement in economic conditions in our main markets, which have facilitated inflows of remittances, among other things. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, The current account deficit measures the amount we spend overseas as against the amount we have earned. When we do not earn enough, we have to make up the difference by capital inflows and borrowing if we are to maintain the same level of consumption and also maintain a healthy level of foreign reserves at the Bank of Jamaica. Let me remind the country that at the beginning of the program, the current account deficit was 13.4% of GDP. Today, it stands at 5% of GDP. And, Mr. Speaker, it is projected for the next fiscal year to be 2.3%. We can begin to contemplate, Mr. Speaker, a time when we can have a surplus on our current accounts. I now turn to unemployment. The average unemployment rate for 2013 was 15.2%. By 2014, the average unemployment rate had been lowered to 13.7%. For us, this is still too high, but there is no doubt that we are heading in the right direction. With respect to the inflation rate, Mr. Speaker, the inflation rate for the calendar year 2013 was 9.5%. We can now report a significant reduction in the inflation rate for the calendar year 2014 to 6.4%. The anticipated improvement in inflation over this fiscal year is even more remarkable. Fiscal year to date inflation stands at 4.1%. We can anticipate an inflation rate for the fiscal year at or below 5%, Mr. Speaker, when we take account of March. I would like to point out that the last fiscal year recording inflation lower than this was 1971-72, some 43 years ago. Again, Mr. Speaker, we are moving in the right direction. In the context of contained inflation, the bolstering of the Bank of Jamaica's gross reserves by the proceeds of the $800 million US bond and the improved Jamaican dollar liquidity, domestic interest rates declined during the year. Average yields on the Government of Jamaica 30-day, 90-day, and 180-day instruments declined. Similarly, there was a downward trend in the average yields on Government of Jamaica global bonds. To summarize, inflation, the current account deficit, the debt to GDP ratio, unemployment, and the net international reserves are all moving in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, this is progress. Yes. All indicators point to the growing competitiveness of our exchange rate and even stronger rates of investment activity and job creation. We should remind this Parliament and the country also that the economic reform program does not simply involve running a high primary surplus and expenditure restraint, necessary though that has been. But the program involves as well the implementation of far-reaching structural reforms aimed at making the Jamaican economy more competitive, efficient, and able to make its way in the highly integrated and competitive globalized world of the 21st century. This past year, We have continued our ambitious legislative calendar. We passed the Insolvency Act and introduced a new Electricity Act, and a new procurement bill has been tabled in Parliament and is currently being considered by the House. We have established a collateral registry under the Secured Interest in Personal Property legislation. We have strengthened the administrative powers of the Tax Administration, Jamaica, through legislation and introduced an electronic platform for the payment of taxes. We have streamlined business registration and the development approval processes to achieve a 90-day window. We have achieved it, Mr. Speaker, a 90-day window for development approvals, and we have also improved operations of Jamaica Customs. It is as a result of this new legislative framework, together with the general improvement in the macroeconomic environment, that the international community is not only taking note of, but is acknowledging the extent of the progress that we have made. The World Bank's Doing Business 2015 report showed an improvement in Jamaica's ranking from number 85 to number 58 out of 189 countries. Of note is that Jamaica is now the best rated country in the English-speaking Caribbean and one of the most improved globally. Jamaica has also moved up 8 places on the Global Competitiveness Index and is now ranked 86 out of 144 countries for 2014-15, up from 94 in 2013-14. The 2014 Forbes Best Countries for Business report ranked Jamaica 64 out of 146 nations, making it the best country in the Caribbean region to do business in, and the 3rd in Latin America and the Caribbean. These are achievements for which all Jamaicans should be proud, and I expect my colleagues on that side to be as proud of it as we are on this side.
Expect to be proud of it too, as we are.
That you should be proud of Jamaica's achievements, no matter who helped achieve it. Yes. We should remember, too, that over this past year, the country implemented the most far-reaching tax reforms that have been done over the past 20 years or more. We have introduced a suite of legislation designed to revamp our previous system of fiscal incentives. Customs Tariff Resolution, Stamp Duty Order, Fiscal Incentives Act, and the Income Tax Relief Act are just some of the acts that were amended. There is an amendment to the Customs Act effectively reducing duties on commodities and eliminating duties on all productive inputs, including intermediate goods. A new Fiscal Incentives Act which introduced employee tax credits to relieve the investor of the potential cost of statutory deductions and provide for more generous capital depreciation allowances to amortize the value of the investment over the realistic life of the investment. The net effect of these changes has been to substantially incentivize the productive sectors and improve the rate of return on investment. Mr. Speaker, this road has not been an easy one. Our progress has been achieved as a result of the sacrifices of many, including the public sector workers, the bondholders, the pensioners, indeed the taxpayers generally, to whom this administration, this Parliament, and indeed this country will forever be indebted. It is as a result of their sacrifices that we have been able to lay the strong foundations on which we can now build confidently. Let me remind this Honourable House, Mr. Speaker, that despite the fiscal constraints, this administration has met its social obligations, even as we implement the economic reform program. We have met the obligation to protect the most vulnerable sections of the population. Under the extended fund facility, we established, and I say we established a social spending floor and committed to ensure that the overall level of real spending on critical programs in health, education, and social security and youth employment were maintained each year. This is unique in the history of IMF programs, and we are proud that we insisted on it. We didn't want to have a program that was only cutting on those areas of a budget needed by the poor. Since 2012, we have increased payments to the PATH beneficiaries by 30%, with the elderly receiving a 67% increase. Because of our concern for our children in this country, especially those who are most needy, we have instituted a transport allowance under the PATH program in order to ensure that these children attend school. $72 million has been assigned in this budget for that transport subsidy. We have strengthened the school feeding program, moving the budget from $3.5 billion in 2012-2013 to $4.4 billion in the next fiscal year. Over the past 2 years, the program has been expanded not only to benefit more children, but to improve the nutritional content of the lunches by ensuring that they eat more Jamaican food. Rather, the Jamaica Agricultural Society, the Ministry of Education have all combined to utilize local produce, local fruits, local eggs, and we have recently introduced a breakfast program at the early childhood level that will see 70% of the children in these institutions receiving free breakfast. Cannot learn is a well-established fact. You cannot learn on a hungry belly. It is because of our recognition of the difficult circumstances faced by so many vulnerable Jamaicans that we have implemented the Jamaica Emergency Employment Program, JEEP, which today has provided employment for more than 50,000 Jamaicans at an approximate cost of $6 billion. It is because of our recognition of the plight of some of the vulnerable elderly that we have each year ensured that government pensioners continued to receive an increase in their pension benefit. We are happy to announce to the Pensioners Association that for this year we have provided an additional $600 million for existing pensioners, an increase of over 20% against the allocation for last year. There is no doubt that the fiscal reforms undertaken so far have carried us into a new ballgame, in which there are new and exciting possibilities for economic growth and for investment at every level of the economy. This new environment is defined by the implementation of the new fiscal rules and the associated legislation, by new debt management rules, insolvency rules. These changes will be protected, however. As I've already indicated, our debt has been reduced and is on a downward path. And the financial markets have responded positively. Inflation will be the lowest in living memory. And though some of this is attributable to oil prices, a lot of it is the result of the reforms of the past 3 years, and in turn will present the country with major opportunities arising from lower interest rates, more competitive exchange rates, and a stabilized market-driven exchange rate. The low inflation environment presents a more stable platform for growth and long-term investment. We have to protect and build on these gains which have resulted in macroeconomic stability and predictability. Understandably, many want to see more expenditure in every area of the budget, and without doubt, there are needs in many areas. However, the fact is that when we decide to spend less, we also borrow less. And the benefit to investors is the continued scope for the reduction of interest rates and more productive investments and job creation. We propose for Jamaica to work its way out of the debt, work its way to prosperity, not to borrow our way into the future. What now needs to be done for the future? In addition to maintaining fiscal stability, there are other reforms that will need to be undertaken to strengthen the foundations of our financial sector and to improve the efficiency of the public sector. The amendments made to the Banking Services Act over the past year will enhance the safety and soundness of the regulatory system for deposit-taking institutions. Later this year, a new framework will be implemented which will see changes effected in the retail repo markets to strengthen the protection for investors in that market. We will also be bringing legislation to Parliament later this year to assign institutional responsibility for safeguarding overall financial system stability to the Bank of Jamaica. The legislation will mandate the establishment of a Financial System Stability Committee that will coordinate the activities of the regulators in remaining financial system stability. It will make provisions for enhanced oversight of financial institutions whose operations are deemed to be of systemic importance. The legislation will grant the necessary powers to the Bank of Jamaica to obtain information from systemically important financial institutions so that risks to the entire financial system can be assessed and measures taken to mitigate and control those risks. On the matter of financial inclusion, I have initiated the preparation of a national strategy which will be completed during this fiscal year. This strategy will be a roadmap of policies, programs, projects and actions that stakeholders will follow to improve financial inclusion. What do we mean, Mr. Speaker, when we talk about financial inclusion? By this, I mean a financial system that makes available good quality, high quality financial products and services to all Jamaicans, including those who were previously unbanked or underbanked, at affordable costs and through appropriate and effective channels. An interesting fact, Mr. Speaker, is that while about 80% of the population has a bank account, 50% of small businesses say they have never borrowed a loan from the bank. Now, these are conditions that we need to correct if we want our small businesses to grow and expand and generate more employment. We have to clear the blockages that might exist in the financial system. We have to prepare the small business sector and others to become creditworthy so that they can get access at reasonable terms to the banking system. Let me look at another area where financial inclusion becomes relevant. In many of the mortgage institutions, we have a situation where savings are made by the poor but mortgages are provided for the better off.
Minister's time for speaking has expired.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the member's time for speaking be extended sufficient to allow him to complete his presentation.
The question is that the minister's time be expended sufficiently for him to complete his presentation. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it.
It is true, Mr. Speaker, that Jamaica enjoys the benefit of a robust and diversified financial sector that has been through testing times and that has demonstrated its resilience, its adaptability, and its capacity for innovation. We need, however, to build on this strength and direct this capacity for innovation to the development of viable business models for low-income customers through accessible deposit accounts and full exploitation of the opportunities presented by mobile payment platforms, for example. This effort will also include continuation of those policies and programs to expand access to affordable credit to the medium, small, and micro enterprise sector through programs such as the DBJ's Partial Credit Guarantee Program, about which I will say more later. We will also use this vehicle to explore and develop innovations in housing finance. We will also be devising a more comprehensive framework for consumer protection in financial services. Banks and other financial institutions need to be more transparent with their customers and share all the information relevant to the obligations that they're asking their clients to enter into. We also need to undertake efforts to improve financial literacy so that consumers are empowered to gain the best advantage from a diversified and competitive set of financial service providers. Apart from financial sector reform, Mr. Speaker, the second major task relating to the reform program concerns public sector transformation. Let me be clear on this. We on this side do not share the view of those in society who see public sector transformation as a synonym for layoffs and redundancies. We don't share that view. What we are referring to when we speak of public sector transformation and modernization is the process by which we will restructure public sector institutions to establish systems that are efficient, flexible, responsive, and accountable to the people of Jamaica and the public that they serve. We need a public sector that sees its role as facilitating every member of the public, whether they are small, medium, or large. We need a public sector that is able to deliver critical social services such as education and health, as well as other effective services, managing crime, for example, and antisocial behavior. Every citizen of Jamaica must become the center of concern of Jamaica's public service. And it must be a service that offers courteous, effective, and timely services. In order to ensure that we deliver on this undertaking, the government of Jamaica has developed an action plan for public sector transformation with an initial set of projects. As soon as these projects are completed, additional activities will be placed in the action plan in order to ensure that that public sector transformation is sustained over time. Among the specific projects to be implemented in the course of this fiscal year is the second phase of the automated system for customs data. ASICUDA, it is called. The targeted date for the completion of this phase is June 2015. ASICUDA is a customs management system designed by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, to administer customs functions through automation and the control of core processes. The system also provides timely, accurate, and valuable information to support monitoring and planning for customs purposes, and it will facilitate importers and exporters among other users of customs services. Another project is the e-trade system, a system being developed by eGov Jamaica to upgrade and coordinate the automated licensing and permitting systems in the various regulatory agencies. In the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, for example, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Industry, Investments and Commerce. There will also be a single trade electronic window. That is a facility that will allow traders to lodge documents in an electronic format to a single entry point to meet import, export, and transit-related requirements. This single entry window will link users to coordinated automated trade systems. Of particular note also is the Amanda system, which has already been implemented in all parish councils and in 8 referral agencies, including NEPA. Its objective is to reduce the length of time it takes to get development approvals. We want to facilitate the investors. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the development approvals process, the Ministry of Local Government and parish councils are to be commended for having achieved the 90-day approval threshold for all those approvals that do not require environmental assessment. And I believe the Ministry of Land, Environment and Climate Change is also deserving of commendation in this regard. This is a target that has been attempted by many previous administrations, but has been achieved by this one for the first time at last. Of strategic importance too will be the re-engineering and automation of the application process at the Government Electricity Inspectorate. That will make it easier for applicants to access the service in a timely manner and remove the difficulties and delays that many developers now face. Mr. Speaker, people might say this is a simple matter. That doesn't merit mentioning. But the fact is, it is sometimes the apparently small things that become the block to serious investment activity. It makes no sense to put in a hotel and have it locked up for days or weeks because you can't get the government electricity inspector to come and approve the inspection so you can begin the task of employing people and earning money. So you can build a second and a third and a fourth hotel as you go along. We are moving in the direction of shared corporate services across the entire public sector. Of particular note is the decision of government to improve efficiencies in the public sector by sharing corporate services across ministries and departments to address system-wide efficiencies. The Cabinet has already decided to implement this shared services model in terms of legal services provided by the Attorney General's chambers and to empower ministries and departments and agencies to secure legal services subject to the ultimate approval of the Attorney General's chambers, where approval of these opinions are granted. Over time, all these changes will result in the emergence of a more efficient, nimbler, and better paid public sector, as we build the capacity in the public sector for speedier decision-making and more timely responses. I want to say something, Mr. Speaker, with respect to future reforms about labour market reforms. One achievement which we take pride in as a country has been our creation of a modern industrial relations framework which underpins an essentially harmonious relationship between workers and their employers, and which, Mr. Speaker, protects the interests of both groups. However, there are still elements of our industrial relations practices which need to be updated to conform to the requirements of today's global economy. Last year, after many years of consultation, the flexi-work legislation was passed. And I want to commend the Minister of Labour for his stewardship in that regard. Again, many tried before, but we brought it into existence. This legislation will create the environment for enhanced productivity and will allow employees to negotiate more flexible work schedules with their employers. More needs to be done, however, to ensure that our industrial relations environment and the operations of our labour markets generally facilitate higher levels of productivity and are compatible with modern labour market practices. The critical factor here is the incorporation of the most up-to-date technologies and innovations in the production process. To this end, the government has established a new Labour Market Reform Commission which will be chaired by Dr. Marshall Hall and will be comprised of representatives from the trade unions, employers, the academic community, and the public sector. The Commission is to be supported by a secretariat which will operate out of the Planning Institute of Jamaica and which will be coordinated by that notable trade unionist, Mr. Lloyd Goodley. And I want to thank both Dr. Hall and Mr. Goodley for agreeing to step to the plate and give the country the benefit of their considerable years of experience. Just winding up. As them say, you got tired for some face. You think so? Mr. Speaker, I think I'm going to give legal advice. I'm going to give legal advice. Mr. Speaker, I turn now to the growth agenda. The central preoccupation that concerns all of us is the achievement of sustained increases in production and job creation. In a word, we all seek more growth in the economy. The economy returned to growth in 2013. This was sustained in the first quarter of this fiscal year. However, the growth momentum was set back as a result of the impact of the drought conditions which wiped out much of the agricultural sector in the third quarter. The baseline projection for growth for 2015-2016 is 1.6%, although I should point out that the IMF's projection differs from ours and is more optimistic than our own. Be that as it may, the efforts of the Cabinet seek to realize the upside potential and exceed the baseline estimates resulting from better coordination and implementation of the projects. In considering the issue of growth, Mr. Speaker, it is important for me to emphasize that the problem in Jamaica does not relate to a short-term fix of essentially what the economists would call a cyclical downturn. The fact is that we do not have in place in Jamaica an already existing productive capacity up to world-class standards, such that all we need to do to correct the situation when there is a downturn or there's a short-term contraction in the market is spend more money, increase demand, and get this productive plant back into operation. On the contrary, Jamaica's experience of low growth has existed for a very long time. Over the past 4 decades, growth has averaged less than 1%. The record of the previous administration confirms that achieving growth is a problem. I would have done in the 70s.
70s was easy. World crisis.
Between 2008 and 2011, there were 12 consecutive quarters of negative growth.
What? Repeat.
No, I don't want, I'm not doing this to throw word at anybody. Part of this, without doubt, was attributable to global market conditions. But the low growth rate is more so reflective of a longer-term structural condition of low productivity and lack of competitiveness that has existed for decades. The implications are clear, Mr. Speaker. Establishing effective foundations for sustained economic growth involves a longer-term solution and a much more comprehensive set of reforms than is implied by much of the current public debate. The critical planks of the strategic growth agenda which we are currently pursuing may be summed up as follows. First of all, fiscal consolidation, which centers upon the reduction of the deficit and the debt, tax reform efforts to provide for a more favorable business climate and investment climate, public sector transformation, control of inflation, and financial sector stability. The second plank involves improvements to the business environment that make our economy more competitive. While substantial gains have been made, as reflected, as I've said, in the competitiveness and doing business surveys, this is still a work in progress. It will only be completed when we reform the financial sector and secure a sustained downward movement, not in the signal rates at the Bank of Jamaica, but in lending rates, even as we broaden access to financing for business startups and establish venture capital funding and the like. It will also require improving the efficiency of the main public sector entities that interface with the investor community, such as the Bureau of Standards, Jamaica Customs, the environmental agencies, parish councils, NEPA, etc. And it will involve the continued reduction in the price of electricity for the productive sector. The third plank involves the development of human capital and increasing the productivity of the labor force. I already indicated some of the measures currently being implemented, such as flexi work and labor market reform. However, we still need to address issues such as education and skills training and other labor productivity enhancing measures and reforms that will need to be undertaken. The fourth plank of the growth agenda are the investment in strategic projects that can act as catalysts to accelerate the growth momentum, expand employment, and enhance in the near term the productive capacity of the country. Today, laid in the House, is a document summarizing our growth agenda, which reflects our commitment to transparency and accountability. We don't claim that it is a perfect document and it cannot be improved upon, but we believe it is a mission for the entire country, and we are prepared to put our proposals out there so that we can be judged and assessed, and so that useful suggestions can be made, because we all want the country to grow, and to grow at the fastest rate possible. I now turn my focus to some of the critical strategic investment projects.
When I speak definitively. I like that. Like that. That's not the president speaker.
Just my advice to you is be still and watch the salvation of the Lord. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn attention to some of the critical strategic investment projects. That's another version. Let me begin with the Agri-Parks initiative. The primary objective is to bring underutilized rural land and labor into a more efficient agricultural production system. As a result, crops are being produced at competitive prices to facilitate import substitution, enhance the agricultural supply chain, deepen industrial linkages, and increase food security. 8 agri-parks have already been successfully established, and 2 more are to be established in this fiscal year. The agri-parks, when fully implemented, are expected to impact some 5,000 Jamaicans directly and indirectly as investors, farmers, and workers, and have approximately 3,200 hectares of underutilized land brought into production. 21 additional agri-parks are to be built over the period up to 2017-18. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to make an observation. And it is significant to the agri-parks because each of these parks are going to be equipped with irrigation systems. Now, one of the things that emerged in the last drought is that the drought essentially wiped out a good portion of the agricultural growth which was taking place. And what that revealed is the lopsidedness in the infrastructure of agricultural production which existed previously. The truth is, over the years, we have provided irrigation systems only for a few traditional export crops, mainly sugar. And now that domestic production of non-traditional domestic and other crops has come in. We are relying on rain-fed agriculture thousands of years after irrigation systems were developed by mankind. We intend, through the agri-park system, to change that reality and provide for the irrigation systems that will enable us to be more competitive. I now turn to an exciting and vibrant area of economic activity, and that is the business process outsourcing subsector, the BPO industry, which is presently making a major contribution to employment generation and augmenting economic growth. A national 5-year strategy for the expansion of the sector has been prepared, and it will see an increase in employment from the current levels of 15,000 plus. 17,000. All right, 17,000. But we believe the strategy aims to increase employment up to 30,000 by 2020. But quite frankly, we believe that is a conservative estimate. And quite frankly, the sky is the limit where Jamaica is concerned in relation with this BPO industry. I tell you what is happening. Well, just hold on. I will explain to you. Hold on. As I said, be still. A strategic objective is to move Jamaica up the value chain in the BPO industry, from simple call centers to knowledge processing centers and outsourcing more professional services, legal and accounting services. We want to see our big law firms getting involved in the BPO segment, offering legal services and accounting services for the accounting companies. No doubt the Minister with responsibility for industry, investment and commerce will speak further. But we are confident that the space will be provided both by government lending through DBJ and others, and private investors putting in their own space, as occurred with the purchase of the new Clara building by a private investor, well known to you, who put his money confident in his country and now has all of that building rented out to a major BPO operator in the country. Very good Jamaican who made his investments. In recent months, we have seen the construction and lease of 50,000 square feet of space at Barnet Estates, Barnet Tech Park in Montego Bay. Plans are being finalized and negotiated for another 150,000 square feet. The techs here have 100,000, but I spoke with the investors yesterday who said they have just contracted for an additional 50,000 on top of this. In Mandeville, a 70,000 square foot facility has been completed and they are now recruiting for jobs. All told, Mandeville is going to become a major center because it has one of the highest number of educational institutions going from basic school to university in Mandeville. All told, the sector is expected to add approximately 6,500 jobs in 2015-2016. Minimum 6,500 jobs 2015-2016. I have noted concerns have been expressed regarding the nature of the tax regime to be applied to the sector when the existing free zone regime ends. I've asked the incentive working group chaired by Mr. Joe M. Matalan, to hold consultations with the sector and with the Ministry of Industry, Investments and Commerce in order to ensure that we secure an internationally competitive fiscal regime in that sector. And I want to say to the entire investor community, we are not going to let the opportunities in this sector pass us this time around. No, I didn't give that speech 4 years ago. 4 years ago? 4 years ago, probably you were giving it. You gave that speech.
4 years ago. You were in the and you're responsible.
You gave that speech. You're like the banquet where them give him chicken and then give him steak and then give him lobster and then him say, where is the cake? Energy, Mr. Speaker. Energy and electricity generation. Continued reduction in Jamaica's energy cost is an essential prerequisite for sustained growth. Cabinet last year, at the direction of the Prime Minister, appointed the electricity sector enterprise team to develop a program to modernize electricity generation and related facilities in the short term in order to significantly reduce the cost of electricity. The recommendations by the team, which the government accepted and which the government is committed to implement, include the conversion by JPS of the Bogue power plant to gas. This is targeted to be completed by the end of this calendar year, 2015. The establishment at Alpat of a 140 megawatt gas turbine cogeneration plant by UC Rizal, which will sell electricity under a power purchase agreement to JPS, and the replacement of a significant portion of the JPS base load capacity by the company with a 190 megawatt gas turbine power plant. Mr. Speaker, the JPS has been working collaboratively with ESET and with Ministry of Energy, and we recognize that in the circumstances it is in their interest and our interest to ensure cheaper electricity, which is what will grow the demand for electricity through a productive sector that is competitive. Mention should also be made of the progress with respect to renewables. There's a US $45 million expansion of the Wigton wind farm by an additional 24 megawatts to complement the existing 38.7 megawatts that are already established in South Manchester. The project has broken ground and is expected to be commissioned in February 2016. commendation is due to the Minister and the Ministry of Energy. A lot of wind and a lot of energy. This is not a promise, you know. This is being implemented now. As is the Blue Mountains Renewables, which recently broke ground in St. Elizabeth for another 34 megawatts of wind-generated power. The project is valued at US $90 million. $90 million and is jointly financed by the United States Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, and local private sector interests. This is not a plan. This is happening now. Finally, WRB Enterprises will be constructing a 20 megawatt photovoltaic generation facility. That is to say solar. To break it down. Solar. At a cost of approximately, this solar generating facility, the largest in the Caribbean, being constructed at a cost of approximately $60 million. Commissioning is scheduled for this year and will create between 30 and 60 new jobs. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will reduce our dependence on oil, imported oil for electricity. Already as a result of improvements made together with the reduction in the price of oil, the cost of electricity has declined over the past year from some 40 US cents per kilowatt hour to around 28 cents per kilowatt hour. This has affected positively many of our private sector enterprises over the past year. I want to mention the tourism sector because it's another, Mr. Speaker, where I can say, frankly, there is no limit to what we can achieve in that sector. The pace of growth in tourism is accelerating with a healthy increase in visitor arrivals, running in excess in terms of stopover at 6% in the current winter season. It is important to point out that this growth is being felt across the sector, from large hotels to small hotels, and now individual owners who are successfully offering a growing bed and breakfast service. I want to invite all colleagues, including you, to visit the website. Write it down: www.airbnb.com. There you will see the range of accommodation and the kind of service that ordinary Jamaicans are offering to visitors in our country. And we are going to break the tourism from this controlling all-inclusive model. We're not opposed to all-inclusive. We are not opposed to all-inclusive, let me say, but we are for the rest of Jamaica getting an opportunity to share in the possibilities of the sector. One of the things that is making that possible, I should add, is the 40% reduction in major crimes that has resulted over the past 3 years. And when we get it down further, we're going to have the place where people walk up and down, ride bicycle up and down the country, take car, hike, do everything, walk through Trenchtown, go to the Bob Marley Yard and thing. Going up to the Bullet Mountain, going through Kellits, coming into Maxfield Park, even going up Red Hills Road. we're going to revive the nightclub life up there, which has been closed down. Yes. We must expand our minds, allow ourselves to think of the possibilities again. You have to first imagine it before it can happen.
And then after we go to Tivoli.
What? But you know, let me take this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to urge all those participating in this tourism product to regularize their businesses so that, among other things, they can access the range of incentives and benefits that are currently offered to the tourism sector. There are a number of investment projects underway which will add further momentum to economic growth. These include the completion of Moon Palace Jamaica Grand over the next few weeks, an addition of 150 additional rooms at Bahia Principe, the upgrading of Braco by the Melia Resort chain. Pronounce it right again. Pronounce it right. You are the Mr. Spain here. The Royalton White Sands Phase 2, representing another 180 rooms. The rebuilding and expansion of the Royalton Grand Lead on the Grill to over 600 rooms. All told, these projects represent significant investment and upgrading of our tourism product. Let me say it again, so the propagandists can rest easy. We are not opposed. No, when I talk about propagandists, I wouldn't put you in that category. I'm talking about the lesser mortals. Let me make it clear. We are not opposed to the all-inclusives. We are not opposed to the all-inclusives. But we want to see more people leaving the gates of the hotels and going into communities. Repeat after me. Repeat after me. Okay. Let them start. Need some of that. Mr. Speaker, in relation to integrated resort developments to be constructed under the provisions of the Casino Gaming Act, I am able to report that the recommendations of the review team have been finalized, and I will be reporting to Cabinet on the findings very shortly, and expect to be able to make a public announcement within the next month regarding the award of casino gaming licenses. If we are to sustain the expansion in the tourism sector, we must continue to broaden the base of ownership and participation. Whereas under the old Hotel Incentive Act, only 80 entities enjoyed the tax incentive, already that number is doubled, and the majority of new beneficiaries are among the small and medium hotel sector. Sustainability will also require that we continue to invest in the infrastructure and upkeep our resort towns to serve citizens and visitors alike. To serve citizens and visitors alike. The Tourism Enhancement Fund, for example, has embarked on an initiative to rehabilitate and upgrade the townships of Montego Bay, Falmouth, Negril, and Ocho Rios. These projects include streetscaping, the creation of shared pathways, jogging, cycling, pedestrian trails, and landscape beautification. In the case of Falmouth, long outstanding drainage improvement will be undertaken. Mr. Speaker, let me remind colleagues that our original tourism areas are rapidly becoming urban growth centers. If these urban townships are to be fully integrated into the tourism product, it will require the coordinated effort of all stakeholders to ensure that attractive and orderly development takes place, with improvement to living spaces for our citizens and visitors, and improvement to the environment for local businesses. The Tourism Enhancement Fund has allocated a sum of 3.3 billion Jamaican dollars, of which 300 million will be spent on the entrance to City Kingston, which I believe, well, they have at least two, one by car and the other by plane. With respect to infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, that remains an important and indispensable part of the growth strategy. In that regard, one of the major projects undertaken in the country is the North-South Highway being undertaken by China Harbour Engineering Company, representing in excess of $600 million of investment. While the project as a whole is expected to be completed by 2016, what I want to mention, it was already mentioned here in this house, but is that, as you all know, a part of the toll concession agreement involves the identification and transfer of lands. 500 hectares as part of it. China Harbour has identified lands, and Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Transport and Works and UDC and the Ministry of Lands to ensure the provision of these lands, and it is their plan to put the part I am talking to here, is that they are designing 3 additional hotels, totaling more than 1,000 rooms for this component of the lands that they have identified. Other components of land have been identified for housing and other commercial developments, up to the total of 500. Other critical elements of the infrastructure program are linked to Jamaica maximizing the opportunities flowing from the expansion of the Panama Canal. This includes the Portland Bike Development Project, And I'll just make one comment here. The project planning, design, and technical work continues. The country needs to know that people don't put $1 billion US dollars of investment on the basis of a whim or a hope. So it requires a lot of technical work which is underway. And because the minister or the prime minister or someone else don't talk about it every day, doesn't mean that it is any less of a priority for the government of Jamaica or for the investors. Let me say too that in relation to the KCT, Kingston Container Terminals, that negotiations have been brought to a point of conclusion, and the Minister of Transport, Works and Housing, subject to the considerations of the Cabinet, will make a formal announcement when he speaks. In relation to the privatization of the Norman Manley International Airport, the position is that 6 firms expressed interest in the asset, and the Cabinet is to determine those that are to move to the next stage, that is to say the request for proposal stage of the process, on the advice of the enterprise team. It is expected that a preferred bidder will be chosen within the next 6 months. Regarding the Jamaica Railway Corporation, discussions with Herzog are advancing and their due diligence has commenced. Mr. Speaker, I want to say something about the medium and small enterprises and the DBJ component. Simply put, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that the medium and small enterprises represent a vital element within the overall growth strategy. It is for this reason that the Development Bank of Jamaica will be focusing on providing for the financing needs of the startup enterprises for medium and small entrepreneurs. The focus of the DBJ activities has grown from year to year. For the first 11 months of this fiscal year, the current fiscal year, that is to say, first 11 months up to February 2015, DBJ exceeded their target of $3 billion to be unlent to medium and small enterprises. They exceeded it by $3.3 billion. By 300 million. By 300 million. And in fact have approved loans in excess of 8,800 loans. For 2015-2016, the Development Bank of Jamaica has set a lending target to MSMEs of $4 billion. But more significantly, Mr. Speaker, are the changes that are being made to their loan guarantee program known as the Credit Enhancement Facility. The board of the DBJ has taken the decision to increase the maximum value of the guarantee from $10 million to $15 million to cover up to 50% of a loan to a small and medium enterprises being accessed. For smaller enterprises up to $5,000, a guarantee will be provided for up to 80% of the loan. Perhaps equally important, Mr. Speaker, is the voucher program that they have implemented to assist businesses to become more competitive in the marketplace. What has been found that one of the reasons why many small businesses can't access even the private capital markets is because they don't have the necessary fundamentals of a business plan, properly prepared accounts, for example, proper auditing arrangements. And so what the DBJ has developed and implemented is a voucher program that, along with the loan, there is a grant for technical support services to be accessed so that they can secure, the small and medium enterprises can secure the necessary technical advice to develop viable business plans and to better equip themselves to operate in the global economy. This was done out of a recognition that many small businesses don't suffer only, and in fact sometimes they are not suffering from a lack of capital, but rather from a lack of technical and management expertise. The Jamaica Venture Capital Program is also on track, and there have been 8 local and international fund managers who have responded to the call from the DBJ to submit proposals in relation to venture capital funding. The DBJ and some investors are now doing due diligence on 6 of the fund managers, and it is expected that in the course of the 15-16 fiscal year, 1 or 2 fund managers will be actively operating in the Jamaican economic space in that period. We are committed to the growth of the small and medium enterprise sector and to new build-ups, new startups in the sector. Mr. Speaker, I want to just touch on some of the expenditure highlights of the fiscal program for 2015-2016. We should remember that the budget is consistent with our efforts to achieve debt reduction and structural reforms for sustained growth. The maintenance of the primary surplus target of 7.5% of GDP remains the key operational instrument for achieving these objectives. The 2015-2016 budget is predicated on gross expenditure of $665.5 billion, comprising non-debt expenditure of $355.3 billion and public debt servicing of $310.2 billion. Approximately $23.9 billion, or 4%, of the gross budget will be financed by appropriations in aid, that is from user charges, fees and grants from public bodies, while the net balance of $641.5 billion will be funded by revenues, loans, and external grants. On the expenditure side, wages and salaries of $165.2 billion account for some 55% of non-debt recurrent expenditure and includes back pay due to firemen, correctional officers, health sector workers, and new pay rates for correctional officers and medical doctors. And it also includes, this estimate, it also includes the calculation of the 2.5% performance increment due to public sector workers. And it includes also the final one-off payment due to public sector workers under the 2012-2015 heads of agreement. What it does not include is the cost of the negotiated, of whatever wage settlements will be negotiated in this year. Yeah, does not. The current fiscal profile envisages a wage to GDP ratio of 9.8% in 15-16. And understand that this 9.8% includes a lot of those retroactive payments, the back pay, the settlement of all disputes, etc., 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 going way back. The government is committed to achieving a 9% wages to GDP ratio by March 2017. I mention this because that figure of 9% wage to GDP effectively sets the limit of our negotiating envelope with the public sector unions. Our intention is to build a relationship with the unions based on trust, which recognizes both the welfare of the workers and the national interest. And I dare say that Minister Daly has made a tremendous contribution, along with other colleagues, in building this level of trust. I tell you, I am very, very optimistic. And why I am optimistic? Because I believe that the workers of Jamaica understand that they have made sacrifices to get us this far, and they are not going to milk the milk, fill the bucket and kick it over, because they are wiser than that. This administration remains committed to honoring all agreements reached. The provision for recurrent programs is $135.7 billion, or 45% of the non-debt recurrent expenditure, reflecting an overall increase of 20% over the 2014-2015 revised budget. Simply put, there's more money in this budget for recurrent programs than was the case last year in real terms. The major beneficiary in this regard has been the public health sector, which is receiving an additional $8 billion. This is reflected in increased expenditure for drugs and medical supplies and other goods and services. Our experience over this past year has underscored the urgent need to build the necessary capacity in our health services to both prevent and respond to any possible outbreak of debilitating diseases. A healthy, well-trained labor force is critical to increasing productivity and creating a more competitive economy. Central government's non-debt capital expenditure is projected at $30.5 billion. Notwithstanding the challenging fiscal environment, since 2012-13, we have provided resources to facilitate completion of several major infrastructural projects, including the Kingston Metropolitan Area Drainage Project, the Palisades Shoreline and Road Project, the Transport Improvement Road Project, and the North Coast Highway Project. During 15-16, we have provided fiscal space to ensure implementation of the following activities: $3.1 billion to meet the costs of 27 new buses acquired for JUTC and due to arrive in April. $3.3 billion to carry out works on selected roadways and bridges and to commence and complete phases 5 and 6 under the GEEP program under the Major Infrastructural Development Program. $1.1 billion to complete infrastructural works and housing units in Luana, St. Elizabeth. and Mount Edgecombe and Bel Air in St. Anne. $659 million to continue construction of Soursop Turn to Chapelton Corridor. No, he has not heard. Approximately $700 million to, among other things, complete works on 2 existing agri-parks and establish at least 2 others. $2.4 billion under the Sugar Transformation Program, which is particularly dear to the heart of the Prime Minister, to continue work on social development projects in sugar-dependent areas and to complete 225 houses under construction in St. Thomas under the Barracks Relocation Program, 145 in Stokes Hall and 18 Hampton Hall. The Prime Minister insists, and we all agree, that time come to take sugar workers out of the deplorable conditions of barracks which have existed for far too long. $800 million under the Citizen Security and Justice Program to continue implementation of social intervention programs in at-risk communities. $1.4 billion to continue work to upgrade custom systems, tax collection systems, and budget and treasury management systems in the Ministry of Finance. $1.8 billion allocated to JSIF to continue community-level social and economic programs, including water, sanitation, roadworks, agro-processing, and personal development programs. Approximately $1 billion will go towards supporting the ongoing transformation in the educational system. Mr. Speaker, between 2013 and 14, 20 schools were removed from the shift system to give our children access to a full day's education. This year, it is proposed that another 24 schools, 24? Another 24 schools will be removed from the shift system by providing classrooms upgrades. In addition to these investments, we should recall that another $59 billion will be spent by self-financing public bodies, including the National Housing Trust, the Urban Development Corporation, the National Water Commission, and the Port Authority of Jamaica and the Jamaica Civil Aviation Authority. I want to mention in particular the Student Loan Bureau. Yeah. I should indicate that the $165 billion of wages includes an amount for the new wage settlements. The new wage settlements, the $165 billion on the wages, includes an amount for the new wage settlements. It does include.
Does.
Instead of does not.
Yes, it does.
Does. Yeah. Now, in relation to the Student Loans Bureau, I want to remind colleagues that tertiary enrollment rate in any country is a major indicator of the quality and productivity of the labor force and indeed of the quality of life generally in the country. It is for this reason that I'm pleased to report that applications have increased over the 4-year period under review. And even more importantly, we are now seeing improved levels of compliance. We have moved from 9,972 applications, just under 10,000 applications in 2010-11, to 16,476 applications in 2012-13, leveling off in 2013-14 to 15,200. The increased rate of compliance that we are experiencing over the past year is a direct result of initiatives implemented by the SLB, including making provision for more affordable monthly payments, increased payments by salary deductions, and the provision of more public education and information, the provision of data to credit bureaus, and stepped up efforts at debt collection. For the 11-month period, April 2014 to January 2015, no, that's 9. SLB collected, the Student Loans Bureau collected $1.56 billion from customers at a monthly average of $142 million. This compares with $1.27 billion collected for the fiscal year 2013-14 at a monthly average of $106 million. Perhaps the important thing to note, though, is that this year, the Student Loan Bureau is introducing a facility called the Pay-As-You-Study facility. This new loan option allows parents, guardians, or working students, or relatives of students who can afford the monthly deductions from their salary to pay while the student is studying. The benefits include the lowest rate of interest for a tuition loan, a longer repayment time, smaller monthly payments. Applications for the Pay-As-You-Study program can be made online, and I encourage all those who qualify to take the necessary steps to access this facility. I also want to indicate that there is a special window being made available for children of public sector workers to access student loans. Effective in the 2015-16, this academic year, the following reductions become applicable to students who are children of public sector workers. First, the processing fees for applications will be reduced for public sector workers by 35%. Interest rates on student loans for children of public sector workers are to be charged at an interest rate that is 1% lower than the standard interest rates. It's part of an effort to facilitate public sector workers who have endured effectiveness. No, it's not part of the wage set. It is in. It is.
But they won't forget it.
It is in recognition of the fact that the public sector workers have endured wage restraint for 5 years, and that their children have had to face privation and encounter. In addition, public sector workers applying for student loans will be allowed to access the loan with one guarantor based on satisfactory assessment.
I'm going to stop that road. I'm going to stop that road.
Mr. Speaker, I want to highlight some other elements in the budget. This budget also provides for an increase in the capacity of the National Solid Waste Management Authority for improved garbage collection. 200 million has been allocated to commence procurement for 20 new garbage trucks. Close to $500 million has been provided to enable the acquisition of new fire trucks and to commence the procurement of a fire boat. There is some ambulances and fire hydrants maintenance. There are some small ticket items, but which are absolutely important to rural people. There is support for water catchment rehabilitation and a rainwater harvesting program with the provision of $90 million under the rural water supply. There is support for the road patching, river training, and the cleaning of gullies by allocation of over $500 million to the Ministry of Transport, Works and Housing. And we have provided $135 million to provide for additional, to the Ministry of Justice, to provide for additional High Court judges, an increase in the stipend to jurors, and to make additional facilities available at the Justice Square complex. And I know that the Court of Appeal has been waiting for the building space.
Court of Appeal?
The Court of Appeal has been waiting for building space in order to put an additional panel. And we have given the commitment, and Mr. Speaker, the Accountant General's Department is going to move in the course of this fiscal year to new accommodations to make the space available. Most of all, Mr. Speaker, and I don't think we just treat it as something to be ignored, we are including over $100 billion to pay down our debt obligations in this budget. Mr. Speaker, obviously, expenditures have to be paid for. And therefore, every budget, as the House will get more and more used to, has both an expenditure side and a revenue side. In December, you can circulate the revenue document. No, they can go on. They go on. In December, it was intentionally blank, yeah. You thought it was zero. We'll get there. In December 2013, Parliament passed, as we have indicated, far-reaching tax reform legislation. Prior to this, Jamaica's taxation landscape had been defined by a system of sector-specific incentives. The basic problem with those arrangements was that, first of all, they created huge differences in the tax treatment between sectors and benefited between those sectors that benefited from an incentive proposal and those that did not. We may call this intersectoral inequalities. Second, as happened in the tourism sector, there was a difficulty of inequality between those entities that benefited from tax breaks and those within the same sector that did not. Over time, that system also created distortions in the economy, since capital flowed disproportionately to those sectors and entities that had the advantage of specific tax incentives, while other sectors didn't get the same kind of attention from investors and as a consequence failed to grow and failed to modernize. What is more, a culture of tax avoidance became prevalent. We still struggle today, Mr. Speaker, with the belief on the part of many that productive activity should not incur any tax responsibilities. This is obviously an untenable situation, since all producers couldn't exist and could not produce unless the state provided security services, health services, educational services for the workers, roads, port services. All of this has to be paid for. As a consequence of that old arrangement, the tax burden over the years was disproportionately placed on certain sectors like the PAYE earners, who had to carry a disproportionate share of the burden, while others were relieved of all responsibilities. Not surprisingly, the overall record of growth in investments has told a tale of relative underachievement compared with the efforts made for investor promotion through tax incentives. With the 2014 tax reforms, sector-specific incentives have been replaced by broad-based benefits applicable to all businesses, with a reduced effective rate of corporate income tax and more attractive customs rates applied to all productive inputs. What is more, the old-time incentives have been largely replaced by perpetual eligibility, so that all firms within the economy are on a level playing field, facing lower and more competitive tax rates. And it is our intention, Mr. Speaker, over time to reduce rates even more as we broaden the base. Perhaps the most striking evidence of the benefit of this revised incentive scheme has been the reinvigoration of the small hotel segment of the tourism sector. A large proportion of these hoteliers had ceased to benefit from the tourism incentives and thus were not able to refurbish and renovate their properties. In addition to providing for lower effective rates, the new tax arrangement also provided for specific performance-based tax credits, which were available to all corporate taxpayers. I am referring here specifically to the employee tax credit, which is available to investors based on the size of their statutory deductions, which mean that their employment and wages to be reduced, the greater, which means, Mr. Speaker, let me state it this way: the greater your employment, the less will be the taxes that you pay. There are also general capital depreciation allowances, which are greater the larger the level of investment and economic activity undertaken. I'd like to remind the House of our basic basic principles guiding our tax policy. First of all, it involves relieving the burden on the most vulnerable and satisfying the revenue needs implicit in the economic program. Members should also recall that our basic commitment is to a balanced budget. This year is effectively the third year of a balanced budget. The deficit is 0.3%. Remember also that this year's budget has substantial increases in non-debt expenditure. 20% more than last year. $8 billion for health, $5 billion for education, $3.1 billion for roads, $4 billion for parks, school feeding and other social protection, $5.1 billion for transport works and housing, for providing both for housing and road repairs. It also meets our obligations to end wage restraint and to repay the principal on the NDX bonds. When the budgeted expenditures for 2015-16 are compared with passive projections for total revenues, there's a revenue gap of about $22 billion if we are to attain the 7.5% primary surplus target. That is to say, passive projections, Mr. Speaker, mean without any further policy or administrative actions, taking account of the rate of inflation, projected rate of growth, and the like. This year, tax compliance efforts, which netted $8 billion last year, tax compliance efforts are expected to provide $12.3 billion. This will be the result not just of mere exhortation, Mr. Speaker. Legislation passed by this House giving the tax authorities access to third-party information, for example, are being utilized to identify gaps in the payment reporting of some enterprises, and those efforts are going to make good. New legislation governing the application of transfer prices that have been developed with support from the OECD will come into place this year and will ensure that there is better reporting and better compliance by companies, and there is going to be greater requirement of withholding tax through financial institutions for critical payments that ought to be made by taxpayers. That leaves, Mr. Speaker, a gap of $10.4 billion. On that basis, the following revenue measures are being proposed, bearing in mind both our revenue needs and, importantly, the commitment of this administration to protect the most vulnerable sections of the Jamaican population. Over the past 3 years, we have raised the tax-free portion of personal income tax each year. Members will recall that this past January, that tax-free portion of the personal income tax, which they call the threshold, was increased to $557,232. The workers whose wages are below that level pay no income tax at all. And at this level, a little more than 13,900 persons were brought below that threshold and enjoyed the prospect of paying no taxes at all. This brings the share of employees who are free of income tax to 36.6% of those in the labor force. It is proposed that in January 2016, that tax-free portion of personal income tax be increased from $557,232 to $592,800 per annum, thereby providing further relief to taxpayers. for all PAYE, all the pay-as-you-earn taxpayers, that will mean an additional $35,568 tax-free income per year. And the impact in terms of lower effective tax rate will be greater for those at the lower end of the spectrum. This proposed increase in the threshold or the tax-free proportion will relieve another 9,000 persons approximately from any income tax liability at their present wages. This will cost $664 million this year. Annualized is about $2.4 billion, which is, this money is being $644 million is being given back to the workers of the country. I should indicate in a commitment made to racehorse breeders.
This call is their Smith amendment.
That category of breeding stock, which currently attracts a tariff of 40%, will be subject to a lower tariff of 5%. This will result in a revenue loss, millibally, well, because of CET operations, of $1 million. The effective date for this measure is April 1st, 2015. We're doing it not because of you. We're not doing it because of you or even my other friend, the leader of opposition business.
You did nothing wrong.
Don't be like him.
You did nothing.
But because we think it is an important industry, and because we believe that as we move to sell Cayman as Track Limited, and I should indicate that the Cabinet has approved a transaction structure for the recommended by the enterprise team, which will enable them now to request proposals, that we want to ensure that the industry, the racehorse industry, remains viable. Thoroughbreds. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has a commitment under Article 6 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control to reduce local tobacco consumption. At the same time, we are mindful that the illicit trade in cigarettes continues, and we are seeking to address this. But in consideration of all the factors involved here, it is proposed that the special consumption tax on cigarettes be increased from the current $10.50 per stick to $12 per stick effective March 13, 2015. We expect that these rates will yield an additional $488 million in revenue, and these receipts will be directed to the National Health Fund. Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that as part of the revenue measures announced last year, the asset tax rate applicable to entities supervised by the Bank of Jamaica and the Financial Services Commission was increased. At that time, I gave a commitment that the measure was for a period, and I quote, of no more than a year, and that the rate would revert to the standard rate as of March 2015. After consultations with the life insurance sector and appropriate due diligence by the Ministry with respect to the data provided and forecasts, we are proposing for the life insurance sector, the 1% asset tax rate be reduced to 0.25%, that the gross premium tax and net investment income tax be removed, and that a corporate income tax on total income will now be levied at the standard rate of 25%. These changes will be applicable to the year of assessment 2015. This revised tax structure is one that we believe allows the sector to be more flexible with respect to its business development and business model, facilitate greater growth in the sector, and over time increase its revenues. For this year, however, the measure is calculated to be revenue neutral. There remains the issue of the application of the asset tax to other financial institutions. This will remain in force during the current year. We are mindful, however, that the asset tax as presently structured for other institutions needs to be reviewed, and we are proposing to do this in collaboration with them in this financial year as part of a broader review of the financial sector. Also, Mr. Speaker, there currently exists an environmental levy of 0.5% of the CIF value of goods imported, with certain exemptions for governments, diplomats, international organizations, passengers, and most importantly, on CARICOM imports. Given our obligations under the World Trade Organization rules, concerns have been raised about the impartiality of the application of the levy because of the exclusion of domestic goods and the failure to apply the levy to CARICOM imports. Since the levy is charged on non-CARICOM imports of productive inputs, but not applied to CARICOM imports of finished goods into domestic markets, we are in fact putting our domestic producers at a disadvantage vis-a-vis CARICOM counterparts who are exporting to Jamaica. Put simply, a Jamaican manufacturer importing productive inputs at the port pays this levy on non-CARICOM intermediate goods. But a Trinidad exporter, for example, comes into Jamaica with the finished good without paying that levy. We think that we need to put our producers, our manufacturers, the playing field in that regard. In light of these anomalies and the need to protect the revenue source, we are proposing that an environmental levy be placed on domestic production to mirror the environmental levy on imports. It is proposed that a 0.5% environmental levy be applied to all qualifying imports of goods as exists currently, but now including CARICOM imports and to domestic supplies of goods, with the same exemptions for services sector, charitable organizations, exempt organizations, international organizations, and mining being kept. For the domestic component of the tax, the following will apply. The total value of supplies sold quarterly is to be used as the tax base. The environmental levy imposed at the ports will be treated as a tax credit against quarterly payments to Tax Administration Jamaica or the domestic levy. Hence, amounts paid at the port are treated as an advance payment against quarterly environmental levy obligation on actual supplies. Net payment obligations are to be remitted quarterly, the same as income tax obligations, using a payment advice. Quarterly installments would be due 1 month after the end of each quarter. E.g., March quarter would be done the last working day of April. Environmental levies treated as an expense on the taxpayer's annual return. This measure is estimated to yield approximately $962 million and is effective April 1, 2015. Mr. Speaker, is an equity issue with your friends. We are for Jamaica first. Mr. Speaker, we all know that there have been substantial changes in global oil markets in the last 6 to 9 months. By and large, for a country like Jamaica, it has been beneficial to our balance of payments and has resulted in significant savings on the country's oil bill. Consumers have also benefited from the lower prices with positive effect for the economy as a whole. We track in the Ministry of Finance petroleum prices at some gas stations, and in one particular case what we saw is that in June 2014, E10 87 octane was selling at $129 per litre. In March, this month, it's selling at $109.5 per litre. For 90 octane, in 2014 June, it was selling at $32.8 a litre. In March 2015, selling at $112.5, and diesel, which was $131.9, selling at $106.2. So there have been benefits to the consumer. However, in terms of the national economy, there are risks. The first risk, Mr. Speaker, which I mentioned, especially in the context of the lowered oil prices, the first risk is that we relax our efforts at conservation, or we relax our efforts to make us less dependent on oil over the medium term. We have made this error before. After the oil price shocks of the 1970s, when oil prices came down again, we failed in the 80s to do anything about it. And as a consequence, today, we still depend on oil for about 95% of our energy needs. We shouldn't make another generation have to pay for our failure to act. Secondly, and more immediately, there is the risk that oil prices move up again sharply, and this would have a profoundly negative effect on our balance of payments and on the economy generally. If oil was to move from its present rate to, say, $80 per barrel again, it would involve, the paper here somewhere, it would involve an additional $500 million effect on our balance of payments accounts. And obviously would see an upward movement again in prices at the pump. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, the government has taken the decision to purchase a hedge in the market against the risk of a sharp increase in the price of oil. Mr. Speaker, perhaps the best way to describe it, at the risk of being oversimple, is it's like an insurance premium. You pay it just like you insure your house, not because you expect a fire to come, but if a fire does come, you want to make certain that you're not living out of it. And so we have taken the decision to buy an insurance premium against the prospect of oil prices going up sharply again and derailing the economic progress that the country is. So we will pay the financial institution for a hedge contract for a specific volume of oil. Quite frankly, given the prices of hedges, Mr. Speaker, we can't afford to hedge the entire consumption of oil in the country. We propose to hedge 50% of our oil consumption, and I'm talking about the non-electricity consumption of oil. What I'm saying here does not affect the electricity component of the oil needs. If the oil price is to move above, we pay the premium, and if the oil price is to move above the contracted price, then the country will get a payment which will allow us to cushion the effect of this movement for the general public using oil and to protect the balance of payments of the country. No, in the meantime we have paid. In the meantime we have paid. We have paid. We pay up front. Like your insurer, I don't know how your insurance contract goes.
Well, it's a mere...
No. No. You are saying that if we get the hedge, don't give the public any. No. What it is, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to pay the contract up front. Government of Jamaica, pay the contract up front for this insurance. If the price doesn't go up at all, understand me, and the country should understand, so because to prevent mischief later on, if the price does not move up, then like with the insurance, you just pay the contract, and that's money that is gone. But in the event that the price goes up sharply, we can be confident that we'll be able to protect the balance of payments and the country and the country's economic progress, and we are able to protect the consumer from the amount. We know that there are lots of businesses and taxi drivers and many people who had to endure and were living on the margins. Living on the margins when gas price was 130 and 135 per litre. What we know that they are breathing a little fresh air. Now that somebody has started to build a little house, expand a little business. What we don't want to happen is that it goes up there all the way up and perhaps the house have to stop halfway, the new business closed down and the economy drift back into the state it was before. And that is why we are purchasing this hedge. That's all right. The third risk, Mr. Speaker, of the declining oil prices is the risk to the revenues. And this year, for example, on the basis of the tax regime, approximately $2 to $2.5 billion will be lost from the tax take on account of the reduction in the price of oil and the fact that an ad valorem component of the taxes, meaning that part of the taxes calculated on the value of what you import is less. In order to pay for the hedge and to compensate for the revenues, we are proposing that effective March 18th, 2015, an additional specific consumption tax of $7 Jamaican per litre will be imposed on Petroleum. This measure should yield revenues of $6.4 billion. Now that $7, Mr. Speaker, is approximately 6 cents US. So, and I mentioned that because the actual effect at the pump we cannot predict at this point. But if the price of a barrel of oil was to move down by $1, for example, the person purchasing gas at the pump could in fact continue to see a downward price movement at the pump. And yesterday, price oil went down. I don't know how the markets will perform in relation to the current prices. But what is important for us to do is to protect the Jamaican people. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to make another point. This is not an invitation to any sector, marketing companies, retailers, or anyone to impose unjustifiable increases on any member of the public. No, I'm not talking about absorbing. I'm talking about raising higher than is justified by what is coming out as the Petroleum price. No. There, for example, we know now, for example, no, the price at the pump is not going to move tomorrow, ought not to, because Petroleum prices remain for the week. Yesterday, set yesterday, and this is effective March 18th, point one. Point two, if the price of oil on the world market continues to go down, since we are talking a 6 cents US per litre, if it went down $1, then you would see no movement at the pump. So if the Petroleum indicates when they set their price, there is no movement. What I am saying, I don't want a man at a gas station paying Petroleum the price at the pump, comes out and says, I am putting up $7 because the minister reports $7. That's not how it should work. Petroleum will still maintain the system. If the price goes up, gas stations have to put it up. But I'm making a third point. You have people in rural areas have complained that they are not getting the same extent of the reduction. That's what they say, but hear what happened now. They say it's because of transport, they say it's because of all kind of things. But the problem is that you will have 5 gas stations in our parish, or 6 or 7. And sometimes the price is as if every man is operating with the same level of efficiency. That don't compute. Competition is the name of the game. Competition is the name of the game. And if you notice in some parts of Clarendon, you have some man selling gas at a much lower rate than another man. I like that kind of competition. We want to encourage efficiency. Now, there is also an issue with petrol that involves the conversion of the 1% petroleum cess to a specific consumption tax at $2 per litre. This arises quite simply, it will have no effect on price. It arises simply Petrojam now secures a cess which they have used from PCJ to fund PCJ. The fact of the matter is that their partners have argued that no, because it is already collected. Hello, it is already collected. It is already in the price now. That $2 is already in the price now. What you're doing is changing it from being a cess to an STCT because the minority partners in the operation have objected for reasons to do with their obligations under the agreement. So they say convert it to a tax. It will go for the same purposes as it went before. That is why this $2 will not have price effect. But it now comes into the consolidated fund in order to go back to PCJ. Approximately. Mr. Speaker, this is not a question and answer session. Mr. Speaker. Yeah, no, you can ask it. There will be a question and answer session.
So any spokesman on foreign affairs? No, he's the deputy spokesman on the economy.
That measure is expected to yield gross revenues of 1.8 billion, which is approximately the amount that the cess had provided before. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't coming to government.
No, it wasn't coming to the government before.
No, Mr. Speaker, there are some various fees which various ministries will have to undertake, and they will be, and approximately 500 million will come, and it will represent AIAs for the most part. I want appropriations in aid. I want to say something about the bauxite levy regime. There have been, in the period of the so-called commodity boom, between 2009 and beyond, the one commodity that did not benefit from the boom was bauxite and aluminum, having to do with specific supply and demand conditions in the market. Now, we understand that the reasons why the previous administration and others have had to do it, engaged in discount operations, reduce the levy in order to keep some bauxite operations open. That regime, interim regime under the Bauxite Levy Act, which we removed the levy, expired December 31st, 2014. The government of Jamaica and the people of Jamaica expect full payment of the levy by those who mine and utilize this non-renewable resource of the Jamaican people. The full levy is now due, and we expect all the companies to adhere to the law, both in letter and spirit. Sacrifices have been made by the Jamaican people in order to keep the industry going during the difficult years. Now that this sector in the world economy is moving to a brighter day, the Jamaican people also want their space in the sun in this sector. Mr. Speaker, with respect to Mr. Speaker, the government over the past few years, because of what has happened in the installation of upgraded generation capacity, because of policies being pursued, and because of changes in the price of oil, the cost of electricity has declined by approximately 30% over the past few months. We are still mindful that electricity charges remain a problem, particularly for the lowest income people in the country. But as I said earlier, we need to ensure that we conserve energy and that people undertake measures to drive conservation. We need it both at the national level, we're doing it in the public sector, and we want individual householders to do it as well. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, we are proposing that GCT be charged at the standard rate for residential customers using above 350 kilowatt hours per month. Above 350 and above. Mr. Speaker, this represents 6.4% of consumers. 6.4% of JPS customers, which means that 94% approximately of all residential users of electricity will not pay anything at all. You never heard no word like that. But more on Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. There is an Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, revenues will be raised, but fundamentally, if somebody can easily act not to pay, simply put in place the conservation measures in your residence. There are some, in fact, the JPS can help you. The JPS will help you put in place energy efficient bulbs, turn out energy efficient equipment. All of these things can be done, Mr. Speaker, and you don't have to do it. And I emphasize 94% of the country's customers of residential electricity will pay nothing at all. The measures put in place before by this administration was to protect the poor, and the poor will be protected by these measures. Mr. Speaker, this administration will continue to fulfill all the commitments we have made to the Jamaican people. And the increase in the budget this year is to ensure that all the obligations we have entered into will be fulfilled. It is a matter of record, Mr. Speaker, that this year we will honor our commitments to the bondholders. You know, let me say something. I wasn't planning to. A JDX was entered into by the previous administration. They committed to keeping a 5.6% primary surplus, which was needed to pay the bondholders. When we came into office, the primary surplus was 3%. 3%. There was no intention to pay them. We take pride in the fact that this year we'll be paying $62 billion to settle NDX. Commitment made, commitment fulfilled. We enter into obligations and we pay those obligations. We have not forgotten that we have reached this far on the road because the workers committed themselves to wage restraint, which satisfied the preconditions of the extended fund facility, and that is why we were able to sign the agreement, and that is why we are fulfilling the obligation to enter into negotiations with them this year. Commitment given, commitment fulfilled. Mr. Speaker, they can rest assured that in the same way they fulfilled their obligations to the country, we will fulfill our obligations to them. We made a commitment to reduce the debt, and this year the debt, which was 145% of GDP at the start of the economic reform program, will be reduced by next March to 130% of GDP. We made a commitment to reduce, it is one by the next year, by March next year it will be 130%. But you chat what you want to chat. You can chat what you want to chat. Mr. Speaker, you should withdraw. That is what, by this March, you must check against delivery. It is written on every page. Rise as much as you want if you can.
You are misleading the country.
Mr. Speaker, make us make it simple. The debt stands now at 139.
Point of order. Yes, Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister spoke of the beginning of the program that the debt was 145% of GDP. He goes on in his statement to say that by the end of next year it will be programmed to be 130% of GDP.
Correct.
In his script, which is correct, it says that it has been reduced to 139% of GDP by March. Now, Mr. Speaker, the point of order is, Mr. Speaker, the point of order is that the minister has circulated a script. He has said something else that is other than what is in the script. And Mr. Speaker, without the clarification that I have made, it is misleading the House and misleading the country.
Mr. Speaker, I said by next March it will be 130% of GDP. I said nothing wrong. You must listen and not only read.
All right, Mr. Shaw.
That is why a certain member came to the House and used the words the fulminating former minister of fumble. And that's fumble.
You are referring to that offensive person that came to the will not be allowed to hear again.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. We inherited a debt. We inherited a debt at 145% of GDP. That debt is now at 139% of GDP, and that debt next March will be 130% of GDP. We made a commitment.
That's what he said.
Mr. Speaker, we made a commitment to reduce the budget deficit in this fiscal year, and it has almost disappeared, 0.3% budget deficit. Our balance of payments current account deficit now stands at 5.3% and is expected to be 2.3% in the coming fiscal year, enabling us to see the prospects of a budget surplus in our future. Inflation this fiscal year. A balanced budget, effectively balanced for not one, not two. This is the third year, and we are going to move to a budget surplus.
The gold standard in budgeting.
Our balance of payments current account deficit now stands, very good water, now stands at 5.3% and is expected to be 2.3% in the coming fiscal year. Inflation this fiscal year will be the lowest in 40 years. Mr. Speaker, we take pride in the fact that despite difficult circumstances of the reform, we have made provisions in this year's budget to continue to meet our obligations to protect the poorest and the most vulnerable in the societies. We have expanded the budget to $4 billion, including both the PATH program and the primary school program for feeding hungry children in school. This year's budget has returned the social agenda to the front burner. We have added $8 billion to the health budget to ensure that the gains of the past can be sustained. We have expanded the education budget because we are determined to end the shift system in schools. We have ensured that our program of infrastructure development will continue. $3 billion have been allocated for road infrastructure, and we are going to open the North Coast Highway this fiscal year. The North-South Highway this fiscal year. We have undertaken the most comprehensive tax reform effort ever undertaken in the past 2 decades. Mr. Speaker, the foundations have been well and truly laid, and we are now going for growth. Tourism is leading the charge with a growth rate of some 7% in arrivals last year. We will be pushing to the limit the business process outsourcing to get 18,000 additional jobs by 2020. Our agricultural sector is revving up. We'll be expanding the network of agri-parks. We are continuing our investment in energy to lower energy prices and stimulate growth. We are undertaking labor market reform and public sector reform to achieve even higher levels of efficiency. Mr. Speaker, I close my presentation with an adaptation of the words of the psalmist. Yea, though we walk through the valley of doubt, thou preparest a table for us in the presence of the doubters and the naysayers. We take our seats at this table with every confidence that goodness and mercy shall follow the Jamaican people all the days of their life. The Jamaican people are a people of faith, and now is the time for us to demonstrate our faith in the future, bolstered by what we have achieved thus far and confident in our capacities to achieve our goals. The estimates of expenditure and revenues, the appropriation bill is before us. Let us approach the future with confidence because the foundations have been well and truly laid. We are now going for growth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I move for the recommittal of item announcements.
The question is for the recommittal of items announcements. Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. Announcements.
Also laid on the table of the House today is Ministry Paper number 34, the document entitled Revenue Measures for the Financial Year 2015-2016.
Mr. Speaker, there is no intention for us to do any further business. I therefore move for the adjournment of the Parliament until next Tuesday, March 17th at 2 p.m.
The question is that the House do adjourn to next Tuesday, March 17th at 2 p.m. Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it. House stands adjourned.
Telligence Inc. Telligence Inc. Turning broadband and internet into services.
Here at the Public Broadcasting Corporation of Jamaica, we keep our Jamaican traditions alive. via our one-of-a-kind programming, content highlighting our world-famous arts, culture and heritage. We go the extra mile to keep you